This was not a war. It was a reckoning that broke the world. Before the fall of Numenor, before the last alliance of elves and men, before the quest to destroy the One Ring, there was a final, apocalyptic conflict that ended the first age of the sun in fire and flood. Its violence was on a cosmic scale. A war so absolute it shattered an entire continent and drowned it forever beneath the waves. The struggle for the One Ring was a war for the freedom of Middle-earth. This was a war for the fate of creation itself. For nearly 600 years, the shadow of Morgoth Bauglir, the first and greatest of the Dark Lords, had consumed the northern lands of Beleriand. The great elven kingdoms had fallen one by one. Gondolin, the hidden city of stone, was a smoldering ruin. Nargothrond, the cavern fortress, was a dragon's hoard. The forests of Doriath were silenced, their ancient magic broken. Morgoth's victory was all but complete. The light of the elves was fading from the world, and the dominion of men was a dream that had died at birth. Hope survived in a single vessel, sailing upon the lightless seas. His name was Eärendil, a mariner of mixed heritage, born of both elves and men. Upon his brow he wore the last of the Silmarils, the hallowed jewels of Feanor that held the unsullied light of the two trees of Valinor. His quest was one of utter desperation, to sail into the forbidden west, to pass the enchanted isles, and to beg the Valar, the very gods of the world, for their aid. It was a fool's errand, an act of trespass against the divine ban that had separated the Undying Lands from the mortal world for ages. No mortal had ever set foot in Aquaman and lived. But Eärendil did not come as a conqueror, nor as a tourist. He came as an ambassador for two kindreds on the brink of utter annihilation. He stood before the thrones of the powers of Arda, and he spoke for the elves and for men, begging for pardon and for pity. He asked not for himself, for he knew the penalty for his trespass was death. He asked only that the Valar might look upon the sorrows of Middle-earth one last time, and deliver its peoples from the tyranny of their fallen brother, Morgoth. The Valar listened, and their hearts were moved. Manwë, the Lord of the Winds and King of the Valar, sought counsel from Eru Ilúvatar, the one supreme being, and the call was answered. The Valar would not ignore the suffering of the children of Ilúvatar any longer. The ban was lifted, but only for war. The might of the West would be unleashed, but the Valar's forgiveness came at a terrible price. For to wage war against a god, one must unleash the power of gods, a power the world itself could not withstand. The Valar themselves would not tread again in Middle-earth, for they knew their unmitigated power would shatter the very foundations of the continent. Instead, they sent forth their herald, Eärendil, mightiest of the Maiar in arms, to command their host. And what a host it was! This was not the broken remnant of the Noldor who had dwelled in Beleriand for centuries. This was the host of Valinor. At the forefront were the Vanyar, the high elves who had never left the sight of the two trees, who had never known sorrow or war. They were joined by the remaining Noldor of Ahriman, those who had heeded the summons to punish the rebellion of their kin and the evil of Morgoth. They crossed the sea in a fleet of white ships, and their coming was like the rising of a new sun in the west. The sky filled with their banners, their armor shone with the light of Achaman, and the sound of their horns echoed from the heavens. The long night of Beleriand was over. A new and more terrible dawn had arrived. When the host of the west landed, the entire continent of Beleriand shook. The first to face them were the Orcish legions that swarmed the northern plains. For centuries, these armies had known only victory. They had slaughtered elves and men with impunity. Now, they faced an army of light. The clash was not a battle. It was a cleansing. The orcs broke and fled before the fury of the elves of Valinor, and they were slaughtered in such numbers that the great plain of Anfoglith was swept clean of their filth. The host of Eärendil marched northward, an unstoppable tide of righteous power. Their goal, the black fortress of Angband itself, where the Dark Lord Morgoth sat upon his throne of shadow. But this was no swift campaign. Morgoth was the most powerful being to ever walk the soil of Arda. His fortress was a mountain range, his armies were without number, and his servants were creatures of primordial terror. The War of Wrath raged for 42 years. It was an age of ruin. Mountains were leveled into plains, and valleys were raised into new hills. The rivers of the north ran black with the blood of orcs, and red with the fire of dragons. The very geography of the world was being unwritten by the clash of divine armies. The Edain, the fathers of men who had remained loyal to the elves, joined the host of the west. They fought with valor and desperation, earning the respect of the Eldar and sealing the future of their kind. They fought to reclaim their world. But even with the might of Valinor, The push to Angband was a long and bloody slog. Morgoth unleashed all the horrors he had been breeding for millennia in his deep pits. Werewolves, trolls of stone and mountain, and legions of fell spirits assailed the host. Yet, step by grueling step, Eärendil's forces drove them back, breaking fortress after fortress, and cleansing the land. For 42 years, the north was a crucible of fire and steel. But Morgoth had not yet played his final, most terrifying card. He had been saving his ultimate weapon, a creation of such apocalyptic power that it would make Balrogs seem like mere embers. Deep within the bowels of his fortress, the host of Eärendil cornered the last of the Balrogs. Most were slain in this final, desperate battle, driven back into the fiery chasms from whence they came, their power broken forever. The armies of the Valar descended deeper and deeper, through chambers of torture and forges of despair, until they reached the lowest dungeons. They had driven the Dark Lord to the brink. His armies were shattered. His captains were slain. There was nowhere left for him to run. As the trumpets of the host of Valinor echoed in the deepest halls of Angband, announcing their victory, a new shadow fell over the battlefield. From the smoking peaks of the Thangorodrim, Morgoth unleashed his final deception, his masterpiece of malice. He released the winged dragons. Never before had such creatures been seen in Arda. They were a storm of living fire and death, and at their head was Ancalagon the Black, the greatest dragon to have ever existed. His body was a living mountain, vast enough to blot out the sun, and the thunder of his wings was a tempest that shook the foundations of the world. The host of the West, which had seemed invincible moments before, was driven back. The dragons came down upon them like a torrent of molten rock, and their fire was hotter than any furnace. The golden banners of the Vanyar were burned to ash, and the light of Valinor itself seemed to dim before this new, ultimate darkness. Ancalagon and his brood were a force of nature unleashed, a final, spiteful scream of defiance from the throat of a dying world. The victorious army of Eärendil faltered, burned, and broke. For a full day and a desperate night, the dragons held dominion. The war, which had seemed all but won, was on the verge of becoming the greatest defeat in the history of the Eldar. The power of the Valar had been met, and for a terrifying moment it seemed it had been surpassed. Was this how it all ended? After centuries of suffering, had hope arrived only to be devoured by a greater despair? Had the children of Ilúvatar been abandoned in their final hour? But there was one last light of hope that Morgoth had not accounted for. From the highest heavens, bearing the Silmaril upon his brow, came Eärendil the Mariner. His ship, Vingilot, hallowed by the Valar, now sailed the winds of the sky, and with him came the great eagles of Manwë, their lord Thorondor at their head, their wingspans like storm clouds. The greatest battle of all was fought in the air. The fires of the dragons met the righteous starflame of the Silmaril. The screams of the drakes were answered by the piercing cries of the eagles. All through the night, the heavens were a canvas of lightning, fire, and claw. Eärendil, clad in celestial light, stood at the prow of his ship, a figure of myth made real, a symbol of the unyielding hope of both elves and men. As a new dawn broke, Eärendil himself fought with Ancalagon the Black. The clash of the Mariner and the dragon was a storm above the world, a conflict of primordial powers, the light of the hallowed jewel against the unlight of Morgoth's ultimate creation. Finally, before the sun rose, Eärendil was victorious. He cast Ancalagon down from the sky. The fall of the great dragon was the death blow to Angband. His mountainous corpse crashed upon the triple peaks of the Thangorodrim, and the towers, forged by Morgoth's power to withstand any siege, were utterly destroyed in his ruin. The last of the dragons were scattered and slain. Victory, final and absolute, had been achieved. But it is here, in this moment of absolute triumph, that we must ask the question that haunts the history of the First Age. Why? Why did this divine intervention, this overwhelming display of force, take so long? The Valar sat in their paradise for over 500 years, while the Noldor were slaughtered, while the Edain were enslaved, while Beleriand bled. Were they truly powerless to act? Or is the truth something far more chilling? Was the War of Wrath not a rescue, but a reckoning? Consider the facts. The Valar did not intervene when Feanor and his sons committed the first kinslaying. They did not intervene when the Noldor fell under the doom of Mandos. They only acted when Eärendil, a man with the blood of elves, came to their shores not as a warrior, but as a penitent ambassador, pleading on behalf of two kindreds. He did not demand justice. He begged for mercy, and mercy was granted. But the Valar's mercy is not like ours. It is as vast and as terrifying as the sea. The host of Valinor did not come to save Beleriand. They came to excise the cancer of Morgoth. And if the entire continent had to be scoured from the face of Ardita to achieve that, It was a price they were willing to pay. This wasn't a war fought for the Noldor. It was a war fought to restore the balance of the world. And the lives lost over the preceding centuries were, from their cosmic perspective, simply part of the equation. The Dark Lord Morgoth was finally cornered. He fled into the deepest mine. And there, he was captured. He did not go out in a blaze of glory. He groveled. He threw himself upon the ground before Eärendil and sued for peace and pardon. But his feet were hewn from under him, and he was cast upon his face. There was no mercy left for the prime author of evil. He was bound with the chain Anganor, and the iron crown that had held the Silmarils was beaten into a collar for his neck, forcing his head down to his knees. The 2 remaining Silmarils were taken by Eärendil, and their light was pure and terrible. The war was over. Morgoth, the original Dark Lord, the master of Sauron, the enemy of creation itself, was utterly defeated. His spirit was thrust through the door of night, out into the timeless void, to wander there until the final end of days. But the power that was unleashed to defeat him was so immense, so cataclysmic, that the world itself was broken in the process. The fury of the war had fractured the very bedrock of the continent. The great sea, the Beligare, rushed in. The northern lands were drowned in a great tumult. The beautiful forests of Eärendil, the ancient caverns of Nargothrond, the hidden city of Gondolin, the land of Hithlum, where the greatest men had been born, all of it sank beneath the waves. The rivers were turned into violent seas, the mountains were torn asunder, and the coastlines were redrawn forever. Beleriand, the stage for nearly all the great tragedies and triumphs of the First Age, was no more. This was the cost of victory. The Valar had saved Middle-earth from Morgoth, but they had to destroy its fairest part to do so. A new world map was drawn by water and fire. With the world remade, Eärendil prepared to lead the victorious elves back to the west. He proclaimed that all the elves of Beleriand were to forsake the lands of their long exile and return to the light of Valinor. And he took possession of the 2 remaining Silmarils, to be returned to the Valar. But the Oath of Feanor was not yet finished. Its poison still lingered in the world. The last 2 sons of Feanor, Maedhros and Maglor, approached the camp of the host of Valinor. They had fought in the war, but they were not celebrated as heroes. They were the last remnants of a cursed line. They sent a message to Eärendil, demanding that he surrender the jewels that their father had made, the jewels for which they had sacrificed everything. But Eärendil's judgment was swift and harsh. He declared that after all the evil deeds they had committed in their quest, especially the slaying of their kin to steal the Silmaril from Dior and Elwing, the sons of Feanor had forfeited all right to the jewels. He told them that they were to return to Valinor to face the judgment of the Valar, and that the Silmarils would go with them. Their suffering, their oath, their entire lives, was all deemed irrelevant in the face of their crimes. The light of the Silmarils would now burn them if they touched them, for they had become unclean. Despair seized the hearts of the 2 brothers. They had shed oceans of blood, sacrificed their honor, and damned their own souls, all in service to an oath that now promised only eternal pain. In their madness, they saw only one path forward, not to Valinor for judgment, but to one final, desperate act of theft to fulfill their vow. They resolved to steal the Silmarils, to claim them by force, even if it meant their utter ruin. And so, in the dead of night, they crept into the camp of the host of Valinor. They were wraiths, driven by a destiny they could no longer control. They slew the guards that watched over the jewels, and each seized one of the hallowed gems. The camp awoke with a great cry, and the sons of Feanor prepared to fight to the death, holding aloft their prize. But a new agony, far greater than any blade, consumed them. As Eärendil had foretold, the holy light of the jewels rejected them. The Silmarils burned their hands with an unbearable fire, a physical manifestation of their guilt. Their right to the jewels had been extinguished by their deeds. The very things they had lived for now brought them only torment. In his anguish and despair, Maedhros, the warrior, the eldest and once noblest of his house, could bear the torment no longer. He fled to the edge of a great chasm, one of the many wounds left in the earth by the fury of the war. And there, seeing no escape from the fire in his hand or the darkness in his heart, he cast himself into the fiery pit. And so he ended his life, and the Silmaril he had fought for was taken into the bosom of the earth. Maglor, the minstrel, faced a different, longer doom. The pain of the jewel was matched only by the pain of his memories. He could not bring himself to part with it, yet he could not bear to hold it. He could not endure the judgment of the Valar, nor could he return to a world that held only grief for him. And so he cast his Silmaril into the great sea, and thereafter he wandered forever upon the shores of the world, singing in pain and regret beside the waves. For him, there would be no end. He was the last of the house of Feanor, a lonely echo of a song that had ended in sorrow. And so it was that the three Silmarils found their long homes, one in the air, one in the fire of the earth's heart, and one in the deep waters. The oath of Feanor was fulfilled, and its purpose brought to a bitter end. The greatest works of the elves were lost to them forever. The first age of the sun had ended. Most of the Noldor and the Sindar returned to the Undying Lands, their long exile over. The world was diminished, quieter. The great heroes were gone, the grand cities drowned, the epic songs sung. A new age was dawning, an age for mortal men to inherit and to shape. But the evil of Morgoth was not entirely erased from the world, for his greatest servant, Sauron, had escaped the ruin of Angband. And in the long silence that followed, he would begin to weave a new tapestry of darkness, one centered not on brute force, but on deceit, and on the forging of the great rings of power. The tale of the First Age is now told. Its sagas are written in the stars, the mountains, and the deep places of the earth. But the history of Middle-earth is far from over. To witness the rise and catastrophic fall of Númenor, the forging of the rings, and the last alliance of elves and men, you must join us for what is to come. Subscribe now to the _Silmarillion_Chronicles, and never miss a chapter of the greatest fantasy epic ever told.